Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. And I see a whole variety of questions that have come in or are pending. And I had a couple of things I thought you all might be interested in that I've been involved in. Maybe we'll take a couple of questions first, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the things I thought you might find interesting. There's a question here from Kat. Do you have any fun April Fool's occurrences this year? What was the best April Fool's joke you've been part of or experienced? You know, for some reason, the mood of the world doesn't seem very April Fool's-y this year. Although I did see one mathematical claim that was sort of at the outer reaches of the mathematics that I think I fully understand. And I have to say that it was a tweet that I kind of picked up that tweet and I asked somebody, "Is this real?" And they sent it back with the April date circled. So I thought it wasn't real, but I don't know. It was sort of at the outer limit of math that I know. I would say that we've done a number of sort of April Fool's-y kinds of things. We had a nice one, which was a kind of handwritten / XKCD-ish version of Wolfram Alpha. That was a number of years ago, where I think it was when Wolfram Alpha was somewhat younger, and there was still some confusion about how was Wolfram Alpha possible, you know, when it was like, you know, doing people's math homework type thing, or chemistry problems or whatever else, you know, how did that work? Was there really somebody there just, you know, solving the problems for them? And so we had for a day, and you can still actually get that functionality in Wolfram Alpha, but for a day we had it by default to produce handwritten answers, and where the plots were kind of like handwritten plots, where there was some sort of jiggle to the curves and so on. That was kind of fun. As I say, there is an option, I forget what it is, maybe if you just say handwritten, it would be probably the NLU kind of version of that. It'll just give you results that are handwritten results. That was kind of a fun one. Another one that I did a few years ago, maybe that was in 2019, 2018, was I wrote a piece, a blog post that was about, what was it, neural blockchain quantum AI. I forget whether the words were in that order, but it was a discussion of, as I think it was called, Buzzword Convergence. And this little essay task I set myself for an evening was, given those buzzwords, which were the most popular buzzwords of the year, was there something which would bring together all those buzzwords? Was there a concept or set of concepts in common between those buzzwords? And the really interesting thing was, in the end, it was an interesting discussion of science, because it was about, you know, blockchain as a way of kind of concentrating many different possible inputs into a single kind of ledger, versus neural nets kind of forming attractors for many different inputs, versus quantum mechanics and the measurement process, and so on. And so it's kind of a fun, I mean, it made it clear that the premise was an April Fool's premise. The content was just an interesting exercise in kind of understanding these different concepts. We've had a number of, I had a number of thoughts about fun things we could do. I mean, I've often wondered, because I'm interested in kind of language and communication and so on, what would a Wolfram Alpha intended for a species other than humans be like? And I have certainly wondered about cat Wolfram Alpha, you know, where the queries and so on are intended for the cat world rather than the human world. But we never implemented anything along those lines. As I say, this year didn't seem to be that. Okay, somebody's pointed out that the title of my piece was Buzzword Convergence: Making Sense of Quantum Neural Blockchain AI. So that was sort of fun. There's a question here about from Jamie. Do I enjoy traveling? Is there anywhere you haven't been that you've always wanted to visit? let me make a few comments about that. So first of all, one thing I have always done, or done for many decades now, is I maintain a list of people and things to see when I am in place X. And, you know, there are many places in the world where I might have been there once, I might never go there in my life, or for some reason, I suddenly am going there. And I like to have, usually when I'm going to a place, I will do three things. I'll look on LinkedIn. I'll find out, is there anybody near there that I've been sort of meaning to see? It's convenient on LinkedIn because it sort of people update their own location, so I don't have to keep track of that. I also have been maintaining this people and things to see in all sorts of different places for decades. That kind of makes the assumption things don't move around too much. If the thing to see is a museum, or the thing to see is a natural object, then chances are it didn't move. Might have closed, but didn't move. So that's two categories of things. And then I sort of maintain this list of people to see if I'm in those places. I have a database which unfortunately is actually in dire need of modernization, and I just started modernization of it. I'm a bit frustrated by it. I call it PBase, my people database, and it's a database of, well, people I know, and it has, for me at least, there's a set of people that I know who will always be on LinkedIn. There's another set that typically won't be on LinkedIn. For example, academics are not usually on LinkedIn, and there's a whole lot of people I know who are in that sphere. I also tend to record in PBase all kinds of information to get some, so that I remember things like just, if I know somebody and I know they have children who are 5 years old then, and I'm going to sort of interact with them again in a decade, and it's like, well, then their children will be 15 or something, and it's useful to remember that, and that's not the kind of information that you have on LinkedIn. So in my PBase database, I also tried in the past to have good geo information so that I could run the query of who do I know who's in place X. One of the things that is a general feature of filing, I suppose, is don't be too specific. I'm like, okay, people in the San Francisco Bay Area, all right, I could separately tag them for Berkeley or San Jose or whatever else, but that would be a mistake because the total number of people that I know in the Bay Area is quite large, but it's still the case that if I'm going to do a trip there, it's not too much effort to scan down the list of names. It might be, maybe it's 100 names, but it's very fast. You've got that 100 names to just see, there's somebody that I'm really interested to see right now, so to speak. So it's something I found very useful. And there are cases where, particularly more obscure places that I might go, where it's like, that was a really good thing to remember, that I knew this person who was, who I've been always meaning to look up, for 20 years. And finally, I'm going to be in place X, and that's an excuse to look them up. And I would say one thing that I've always noticed is, if there are people who live near where I am, it's like, oh yeah, we live nearby, and we'll never get together. But if it's like, oh, I'm going to be in place X just for a day or a day or two, and I'm going to have a spare couple of hours, let's get together. I get around to doing that, and they get around to doing that. I have to say another thing that it's kind of amusing thing that is, many people have never seen the tourist attractions of their local area. I know I'm probably guilty of that. I was just amused. I was in Austin, Texas, just a month ago or something, and I was met up with a friend of mine there, and he's lived there for 30 years, I think. And we were doing a little walk around, and it was kind of cold, and so we were walking near the state capitol building. He says, well, I've walked past this building, thousands of times. I've never been inside, even though he's lived in the town for a really long time. It's like, okay, we're going to go inside. And I remember years ago, I was visiting Kyoto, Japan, and there was a kind of professor there who I visited who had been a professor there for 50 years or something. And there's some particular, major tourist attraction in Kyoto, and I was like, should I go see the major tourist attraction? And then, have you seen it? And the person says, well, no, I've never seen it. So I took him there, so to speak, and that was kind of a fun thing to do. But in any case, I think that this idea of sort of maintaining things to see when you're people to see when you're I found that very useful. In terms of traveling in general, I've gone through several periods in my life when I've traveled almost not at all, for kind of a decade, 2 decades of my life when I basically didn't travel. The thing that was kind of, well, in one of those particularly was in the early 2000s. I was used video conferencing, which was at the time sort of a novelty-ish thing. And there was a period of time when it's like, well, I could go around the world, I could give talks about things, or I could just go to my basement and switch on the video conferencing system I had and do it that way. And that worked pretty well, particularly when that was sort of still kind of a novelty. Although I did have the amusing feature that I had to make sure that when I was doing that, and it's something maybe for today's times as well, is it's like I'm switching this thing on, I'm looking at my calendar, I'm giving a talk to this such and such a thing, and I realize I have no idea, it's a conference about this, that, or the other thing. I have no idea where this conference is in the world. And so I started making sure that in my calendar entry, I actually have the geo coordinates of where is this place that I'm talking to, and I bring up some satellite image just so I have some idea of, because if everybody else is there, they have a definite sense of place, and it's really confusing when I don't. But I also will have to admit that for some period of time, I had the following point of view, which was I really didn't want to travel, because what I found was that I would be doing consistent pieces of work, and every time I traveled, it would make this kind of hole in my work. I'd be concentrating on something, getting a lot of stuff done. Then I would go traveling for 3 days, and then that would leave a kind of a shadow that lasted a week after that when I didn't get things done. And I think that was partly a personal feature of not being able to switch properly between those different activities. I will say that in the past, maybe 20 years ago, when I would have meetings scheduled back to back about different kinds of topics, that I found myself having a really hard time switching between topics. And I would be in the sort of almost like telling jokes and warming up for 10 minutes at the beginning of the next meeting. I finally taught myself, and I don't really know particularly how I did it other than by practice, to do that context switch immediately. And like I sit down to do these live streams, and I was just doing a previous live stream about which was a design review of some orphan language functionality. And I sit down here, I start doing this. I kind of concentrate on what I'm doing here, and I kind of drop what I was doing before, and I can sort of context switch that. And that's a thing I kind of taught myself to do, and it's super useful when you have, because it allows you to really schedule back-to-back meetings and not have lots of wasted time in between them. With respect to traveling, I would say I'm not sure that I've ever quite so much perfected the sort of travel, non-travel context switch. It's also, for some period of time, I have to say, I took the point of view that if it was important enough for me to travel somewhere, I would charter a plane to do that, because it was a lot easier. And it was also kind of an impediment to doing it because it was ridiculously expensive. That was kind of that sort of limited the number of trips that I would do. And that worked quite well for a while, actually. Then actually my children convinced me that it was just a sinful waste of money to do that, and that it was that regular commercial planes were fine and fun, and airports were interesting and so on. And I have to admit that I kind of agreed with them, although during the period of probably a decade when I didn't really use commercial planes much, I think that flying got a lot easier. And Wi-Fi started working on planes, and laptops got better, And in general, it's not a limitation, so to speak, that I have. Now, I have to say, when I was just traveling, when was it, a week or two ago, I have a principle for myself now that I really am going to walk 10,000 steps every day. And I think since fall of 2019, so far, every single day since then, I have walked my 10,000 steps somehow, somewhere. Sometimes when I'm traveling, that means I'm walking my 10,000 steps around an airport. And what I end up doing is, I have phone calls scheduled and so on, and I know which, when I schedule things, I kind of know when, the first ones in the day typically are ones that I'm going to be doing when I'm walking somehow. And yes, in a piece of probably nerdy optimization, if it's above about 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside and it's not raining, I'm going to try and walk outside if I can. And that means that, if I'm looking at a screen, it's probably mostly a phone screen. If I really need to, I can take an iPad or even a computer, but that's less convenient than just a phone. And so there's a slight optimization of what meetings one should do then. If it's raining, for example, I'm going to be walking inside, and then I have a whole computer set up. And it really isn't much different from just sitting at a desk, so to speak. But I have also sort of generalized that when traveling to, make the phone call while walking around an airport, if I need to do that in order to get my steps in for the day. I mean, not to say that there's nothing magic about 10,000 steps. I picked it for the same arbitrary random reasons that other people have picked it. It's just a convenient, decent number, and it kind of has a certain satisfaction to making it over that threshold every day. In terms of traveling and I will say that when my children were, I have 4 children and they are different ages, but 2 of my children particularly were quite interested in traveling, particularly when they were kind of mid-teenagers and so on. And they both happened to be doing online school, and originally homeschooling, then online schooling. So it was, they were sort of free to travel wherever, even if that meant that the class they were doing was at 4 a.m, on the other side of the world, so to speak. One of the things that I will say that I thought worked really well was there was a period of time when there were lots of places where I kind of had an excuse to travel to. And it was my older daughter, actually, who was first like, you get all these invitations, you're turning them all down. You should go to them and take me with you. And so I started doing that. And I would say that worked really well. I think that I will say, I don't usually talk about my children because they don't like me to, but I think the story I'm allowed to tell is my older daughter, who for a while had claimed that she didn't wasn't going to learn anything about computers because that was sort of the teenage rebellion thing, was to not do that. And then she's now a math graduate student. But at some point, a few years ago, she calls me late someday and asks me some fairly obscure Wolfram language detailed question. And it's like, I'm like, I didn't know you knew about that stuff. And she was like, do you know how many talks that you gave in all kinds of weird places around the world I sat at the back of, not really paying any attention? Obviously, I learned some of this stuff through all of that. So that was one of the things. But I think it was, for me, that was a pretty good way to do things. And you obviously have to have kids who are interested. I mean, we visited many places, and I had, I had an intense schedule of meetings, and my kids came to those meetings, and I think everybody found that fairly interesting, it was that worked quite well. But in terms of travel, I have there are plenty of places I'd like to travel to and haven't, just never got around to it. I think it's something where there's always a a certain spectrum of difficulty of traveling there versus, I mean, there are places where one can go, where one can stay in a lovely hotel and it's all very easy. And there's no kind of local issues of, oh my gosh, you thought you were getting a car from here to there, but actually it's some strange form of transportation that barely works and you don't think is safe type thing. So there's a certain spectrum of difficulty, and I would say that some of the places that I certainly would be interested to go to are on the more difficult end of the spectrum. I just have to sort of get the energy to do it. And maybe I have to convince my kids or some of my kids to do that, because that's for me a better way to travel, so to speak. I would say that one of the things that I've tended to do is, if I do sort of pick a country to go to, earlier on when I was doing that, it was always, there was a conference in place XYZ, and then given that conference or whatever, then I would sort of build a trip around that and add in 30 other meetings or whatever around that one commitment that I already had. Then we started realizing that, look, you just basically pick any country, and at least in the business that I'm in, there are users of our technology in those places. There are universities to visit, and I tried to do the following thing. I've tried to visit, when I go to different countries, I've tried to visit. I end up going to universities because I end up being able to give sort of talks and so on there. Companies, government, if that like education ministries, things like that is relevant to what we do, and also high schools. And one of the things I've noticed is, you go to almost any country in the world and you go to a research university, it's kind of the same as, I mean, there are lots of different and interesting universities, but at some level, the cultural experience is fairly similar in different places around the world. People are speaking English, they're talking about the same kinds of topics, many of the same kinds of issues, and so on. As you go sort of lower down the education spectrum, it gets more and more different. And so, for example, high schools tend to be really quite different in different parts of the world. And I find that pretty interesting. And if I can, I find it interesting to meet with, for example, groups of students, both college students and high school students. That's always an interesting thing to do. It's a really, if you want to understand something about a country, it's fascinating, at least to me, to hear what that younger generation says about their view of the country and their aspirations and so on, which are just vastly different in different parts of the world, even different parts of the US actually. But that I think is interesting. I am not a big one for the traditional tourist attractions. I tend to I'm much more interested in the kind of the local people and so on. I guess that certain kinds of museums I find interesting, historical and more technical, tend to be ones I find more interesting. Sometimes the historical museums are fascinating when they are national museums. For example, they're fascinating for the perspective they give you on the way the country sees itself, more so than perhaps in some cases the self-view of the country is vastly different from the view one has from the outside. One may or may not think it's right, but it is different, and it's sort of revealing, I think, to see that. Anyway, that's in terms of, I will say, a very long time ago, this must have been, when was this? This must have been 1983, 4 type time scale. I had two funny things that I did. One was, I said, I'm going to go on a trip. And at the time, there was an airline called People Express that was a discount airline that actually had I was living in Princeton, New Jersey at the time, and they had a big hub at Newark, in Newark. And one feature was that it was, I guess the world was different then. You could basically just get on a plane and go, and you pay on the plane, and it was kind of like a bus or something. So a few times I did the thing of just, go to the airport, and go to the place that was the first place listed on the, the upcoming next plane that was leaving with People Express. And I wound up in some somewhat interesting places, admittedly, in some cases with clothes that were quite inappropriate for the climate of the place. But that was kind of an interesting way to experience different things. And I did that a few times. I also had this idea with a friend of mine that we would pick sort of an arbitrary geolocation on the Earth, pick the coordinates at random and sort of have a little competition who could get there first. We never actually executed this idea. I suppose it's a little bit like the modern geocaching, well, that used to be popular maybe a decade ago, more so than today, the kind of geocaching thing. I tried with my children a few times. I tried going, let's go find the geocache. I have to say, with my particular contingent of children, that was like a blah, we're not interested. And I suppose we did find a few geocaches and they weren't that exciting. So maybe that was a downer for that whole idea. I would say that, a few other comments about traveling, I suppose. I mean, okay, I'll a few pieces of nerdiness about traveling. I mean, for example, there are these sort of little devices that I try to accumulate. Like, for example, it's like I have an app that generates white noise on my computer. It's like, that's a good thing to switch on, because then, the hotel or whatever you're staying in, the thing that happens in the morning, and I'm not very much of a wake up early in the morning kind of person, is you have a little bit of protection against that. And I tend to also have, particularly if I'm changing time zones and things, it's important. I have this, actually it's a piece of Wolfram language code I just run that has a big display on my computer of the local time and also the time since I pressed the button that says I'm going to sleep. So it's like, how many hours have I been asleep? Okay, if I wake up and it says, 5 hours or something, I go back to sleep again. And if it says 8 hours, I'm like, okay, I better get up now. And I don't have any excuse to be tired, so to speak. And that's been useful, but that's also useful because when I press the I'm asleep, I'm awake type button, that goes to some server, and my assistant can notice that and be aware of whether I'm going to be late for some meeting in whatever weird time zone I'm in, and so on. I mean, I could probably yak on about other kinds of travel types of things. I found, here's another thing, minor thing that I found useful. I always have a things to read, in my sort of shared file system, Dropboxy type thing. I've always got a things to read folder where I've got where I just throw things that I mean to read this sometime. And it's kind of like when you're standing in a line somewhere and you don't know what else you're supposed to do, and maybe Wi-Fi doesn't even work. It's, you get out the things to read collection and you're very happily standing in the line, and you're kind of upset when you get to the front of the line because you were just reading that really interesting thing. I suppose that for me, the kind of concept of storing up things to do when I might otherwise be frustrated that I don't have things to do is a good scheme. I mean, like, I always maintain a call while driving list. So if I end up going, for whatever reason, going on having to go on some long drive from here to there, and I like to drive myself. I prefer to drive myself than to get driven. So I'll tend to do that in preference. And then it's, I've got phone calls that I can make, and that's and they're calls where I feel like I wouldn't make them if I was just sitting at my desk. I'd never get myself around to actually making that call. Just like one never gets around to seeing the person who lives in the city that one also lives in. But if there's this extra little thing that says, I'm going on a drive, I've got to drive to such and such a place, I'm going to have an hour and a half. Well, okay, that means this call that I've been meaning to make for 3 months, now's the time to actually make it. And I have one other collection which is a things to watch collection, which is, if I get sick, here are videos to watch, which I have to say, touch wood, I have not had a chance to use for multiple years now. So it's something where, but that's one of my kind of theories of sort of the I'm going to be upset if I'm sick and I'm out of action and so on. But at least I've got these videos I've been meaning to watch for 5 years or something, and I get to watch them there. Okay, people are asking about, okay, there's a comment about good food as an added benefit also in traveling. Yeah, I'm pretty bad in that respect. I have to say, I grew up in England where people, at the time when I grew up, at least people would say much of the food was quite bland. I have to admit, when I was a kid, which was in the 60s and 1960s and 1970s, early 1970s, when I would be at school, for example, and it's like, there's this food and to eat, and it was like, this looks absolutely disgusting, I'm not going to eat it. I have to say that I kind of convinced myself and convinced others that I had allergies to all kinds of foods. And since nobody really heard of food allergies at the time, it was a very kind of convincing thing. Like, I'm just allergic to that. Maybe I was. Maybe the fact that it looked disgusting to me was a kind of cognitive sign that in fact it was bad for me. But anyway, that was so probably that increased the blandness of food that I ate. But I think perhaps also I'm one of these people who's, I guess I'm kind of squeamish. And so when it comes to sort of meat type things, I'm like, food where the thing still has it head on, it's like, I cannot possibly go anywhere near that. And if it's sort of undifferentiated muscle tissue, that's okay. But if there's anything more identifiable, I get all squeamish and don't like to eat it. And so that tends to limit some kinds of food I also don't particularly like. I never really learned to like spicy food. I've never learned to like alcohol. That used to be much more of a problem back 30, 40 years ago. People would say, we've got this very fine wine. And I'm like, I just, sometimes I would have some sips of it and it would just like, I hate this. I don't like the taste of it. But that's something that I've always thought that that's one of those things that I should sort of reserve for later in life, but it's gotten later and I've never sort of gone back to that. I think my only major sort of call it a vice or not is that I do eat a fair amount of chocolate, and although it seems like there keep on being studies that say chocolate is good for you, so that's good. I would eat it anyway. But in any case, I think for some reason I have found that I don't have as good a sampling of food around the world and so on as I might do, because I'm a bit of a squeamish eater and a bit of a bland eater. So I probably don't get as good a sample of that as I might like. And I've also found that as I get older, just the amount that I feel like I want to eat has gone down. And one of the things that happens, okay, so this is another little small thing, is that I made a point at where I'm usually working, there is no food there. And in order to get food, I have to walk, downstairs, get, this. Because otherwise what I will find is that I'm concentrating on something, I'm thinking about something, and I've got this food there, and I'll be putting it in my mouth, and I don't really pay attention to that. And pretty soon I've eaten some huge, pile of chocolate or whatever else. I mean, I suppose also I find that whenever there's, okay, so another thing that I tend to do in the eat less department, I'm one of those people who's in a should eat less kind of group. I have these little pieces of chocolate and I break off little tiny pieces and I put them in my mouth. And I found that as a nice habit. It's kind of it's a fine way. I could take the piece of chocolate and I just stick the whole thing in my mouth. But as it is, I break off a little tiny piece, eat it. Break off another tiny piece, eat it. It kind of extends the time that I get the pleasure of eating the chocolate, and it means I'm not guzzling a giant pile of chocolate. And that I found a good thing to do. But the thing that for me is always difficult is that as soon as I have a certain pile of food, I will eat the whole thing. And somehow I think it may be some kind of perfectionistic tendency is, even though I'm kind of like, oh no, I'll just eat a piece of it and I'll put the other part of it aside. It's basically never what happens. So that's a way that I've tried to control that for myself. Yeah, someone comments here that Atom comments that travel tip, I always have a snack hidden in my bag just in case. Yes, I do that too. Occasionally I've been caught in this, there's just no food here. And so the things that I tend to have like that, I have a power brick, because even though you're on a plane that's supposedly got power outlets, maybe they don't work. That's one thing. I try and make sure that I have enough stuff stored locally on my computer that even if Wi-Fi doesn't work, I've still got plenty of things that I can meaningfully do. A new and different one, just debugged from my most recent trip. I thought I'd solved this one, because I always like these really tiny power supplies, and they've been getting tinier and tinier. And because one of the issues is, do you put a power adapter for your computer in your bag? If they're really big, you kind of like, oh, I don't want to do that because it's going to weigh everything down. But if they're really tiny, you can do that. And I had one which was unfortunately not a successful product, but I had one that I'd been using for the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, which was really, really tiny. I think it wasn't a successful product because when you make a power adapter, there's sort of a big challenge of making the thing not have any possibility of exploding, so to speak. And I think that's always a challenge with those kinds of devices. So I think it was sort of had some challenges in that regard. But in any case, now there are really small power adapters, and I just got a new one. And I was on a trip, and I discovered that on the plane I was on, it's a 2-pin adapter, and the thing just kept on falling out of the plug that it was put in. And I did learn the one thing that flight attendants always have duct tape. That was a useful thing that I had no idea about before. And so with a bunch of duct tape, I did manage to solve the problem. But it was a problem that it was frustrating to have to solve. And the solution is always, which I had done in the past, but I'd sort of gotten out of practice at it, always have a 2 to 3 pin adapter, so that if the power adapter is really loose, you just put the 3-pin thing on the end, and then it will work. And also there's little things that fit around the two pins to make it tighter. That's a very, very practical tip. I mean, I think what I've tended to do is I always have a little, I have a few other little things like this, I suppose. I always have a little bag inside my bag that I have as sort of small things that are in there, like I don't know, things like, I don't know, mosquito wipes, in case I'm in some place like that, my little piece of food, my, various kinds of adapters and so on. And they're all things that are very small, also some cash, things of that kind, things that are, very small and will always fit inside the bag, and then I, put that in my backpack, and that's sort of always there. Another thing I found very useful is we have these things, I suppose we made them as swag years ago, these kind of little, I think they're neoprene, like little tiny bags. And I always put a little tiny bag that's a, shoulder type bag in my backpack. Why do I do that? Because there are many things where it's useful to be able to carry it around, even if you usually have stuff on your back. So like I'm walking around an airport and I want to get myself some water or something, and I've got my backpack and it's on my back, but I also want to be carrying around the water. Well, I get out the little bag inside the bag, so to speak, put that around my neck, put the water in that. That's, I can walk with that. These are very nerdy solutions to things, but the basic point is, if you can have a small enough bag inside the bag, you can sort of always leave it there and never have to think about it. And if you happen to need to use it, then you bring it out. And I find I end up using it quite frequently as the sort of buffer bag to keep things in. Let's see. There's comments about chocolate here. Okay, if you want to go in the full nerd direction, there is a company that we've worked with quite a bit called Emerald Cloud Lab that makes an automated biology and chemistry lab in the cloud, as physical lab. And I was seeing just recently this thing about flavonoid content of chocolates. And I'm curious whether the chocolate that I have, which wasn't on the list in some academic paper about these things, what its flavonoid content is. And so I was thinking of using that as a test case for this automated lab to go and do HPLC analysis or whatever it takes to find out the concentration in the chocolate I was eating. So that's a super nerd activity, but mostly it's just because I want to learn how to use this automated lab, and it's a straightforward thing to do along those lines. Yeah, comments here from HYN about people don't remember portable computers being 10 pounds or more. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I had the experience in, when was it? Probably 1981. I had an Osborne 1 computer, which, except the ancient people here or people interested in computer history probably won't know about, was sort of the first portable computer. It ran an operating system called CPM, and it, which was not what I tended to use. I was using at that time a VAX mini computer, which was a sort of $250,000 object that was, had its own room for itself, so to speak. I was using, a terminal connected to that most of the time. But when I thought, let me be cool, and when I go traveling, have a portable computer. The portable computer was the size of a suitcase, and it had, a CRT in it, and it had a couple of disk drives and so on. And I had the interesting experience of taking that computer through Los Angeles International Airport in 1981, when I don't think the airport security people had seen too many portable computers. And it was a sort of interesting experience in that regard. It was not a computer that ran off batteries. And at that time, I discovered the fascinating ultra nerd fact that 747s, at least on the airlines I was flying on, at the very back of the plane, there was a power outlet that must have been used for a vacuum cleaner or something like that. And you could just plug your computer into that and happily sit in the last row of the plane. That was when planes weren't quite as busy as they are today, and be using your computer. Now, I admit that I didn't do that very many times because I really didn't like CPM, and I really didn't find it that useful. And I wrote a few documents that I sort of stored on floppy disks that way, but it was not a hugely successful activity. Subsequently, I had a whole series of laptop computers. I think the moment for laptop computers, which I really noticed, was the time when I lost my laptop computer in a pile of papers. That was something which there was a certain moment in history where you could start to lose your laptop computer in a pile of papers. And that was sort of, for me, a very noticeable moment, so to speak. Let's see. So, questions here about well, let me, yeah, one thing you guys might find interesting. I was doing a bit of historical work because it's about to be the 20th anniversary of a big book that I wrote called New Kind of Science. And I thought I would write something about the making of a new kind of science 20 years later. And so I was kind of going back and trying to remember, how did I get to do this project? How did I run into doing this project? It was originally the writing of that book. I was originally thinking it's going to be a 1 or 2 year project. It turned out to be a 10.5 year project. And I was kind of looking back at how did I get myself into this? And that requires going back and looking at a bunch of documents from 1991. And actually, we're hoping I have a lot stored in my archives, but I also have some backup tapes, which unfortunately are unreadable by any device that we have right now, but we just ordered a device that was supposed to be here today, but I think it will be here tomorrow, which hopefully will be able to read these backup tapes. Because the problem is that I kept the final files, but there are some, okay, this is an example of the annoying thing. I have an email archive, but the email archive at that time, attachments, I was using the Next computer at the time, attachments and faxes came into that computer, but the archiving system deleted the attachments. But the attachments are probably in temporary files that were backed up by the backup system, hopefully, and were probably sitting there for years at a time. because they weren't until they were sort of cleared out when we got a new computer, a new operating system. So I'm hoping that those things will be there, but they were not, there's a mistake in archiving. They were not there in the archives that I kept at that time. And also there are a bunch of files. I was using FrameMaker, which was a page layout program. And there are a bunch of FrameMaker files that, well, we just we stored at the time when that project ended, we froze a virtual machine of the environment that was used to build the final book. And hopefully that virtual machine will come back to life. I think today is the day when we're trying to get that virtual machine back to life. And that's, by the way, a good thing to do when you have a big project that depends on a big sort of technology stack. Is kind of like freeze the virtual machine of that technology stack and store it away as just a bag of bits. And I mean, I'm saying it's a good idea. I'll be able to confirm that it's a good idea if we can actually bring this virtual machine back to life and have it do the right thing. But in any case, one of the things I was doing just yesterday actually was I was trying to find certain kinds of email that would tell me things about what was happening back in 1991. And so I was reading my outgoing email queue. And because I didn't really have search terms, I really had to read pretty much every message. And so I was reading a few collections of messages for whole months back in 1991 of outgoing mail, and I also looked at some incoming mail. It was sort of interesting to me because there's a certain amount of kind of what mattered 30 years later, what matters from that email. And some of it is building things. And that kind of was, you know, I put in a brick then, and that brick is still in the structure today. And that's kind of a good thing. There's also a certain amount of things to do with outside people and organizations and so on, where it's like, oh, there's a thing that might happen, and it blobs around for a while. And then, you know what, that was a complete waste of time. It didn't happen. And I think one of the things that I learned from that is, you know, the assessment of, is something going to be worth following up, particularly something that is not under your own control. I mean, if it's something where you're building something and it's sort of under your own control to do it, you have, you know, you can determine whether it's worth pursuing. But if it's something that's an interaction with some outside person, organization, whatever, you know, in some of those cases, I can see I had an interaction 30 years ago and that thing became big. Sometimes we had an interaction where we were part of it and it became big and that was great. Sometimes it became big and we weren't part of it because we assessed that it wasn't worth pursuing. But it's sort of interesting that the kind of the level of sort of those external things, I would say on balance, if we just zeroed out everything in my email from a month there and said, not going to do any of that stuff, it would probably not have had, you know, it's a little disappointing that it wouldn't have had more consequence. I think today we're a lot more efficient in that regard, because what we've tried to do, and this is something I certainly would encourage other people to do, is, you know, there are many different things that come in. There are many different kinds of email we get. There are many different kinds of sort of different interactions that we have. And the question is, can you invent buckets for those interactions where something useful can happen with them? I mean, in the company, the thing that is always super high cost is this fuzzball comes in and nobody knows what to do with it. And it winds up on senior management's desk, so to speak. You know, it's much better if anything that comes in, it has some bucket and there's some group of people that know what to do with it and they can just do the thing and hopefully it'll work. Maybe it won't, but sometimes it's even more worthwhile to say, there's a bucket, put it in there, hopefully it will work, rather than the cost of sort of handling the fuzzball is higher than the cost of losing an opportunity sometimes when it goes in a bucket, doesn't quite fit. But I think that for me, there are various kinds of buckets. For example, you know, people are often interested in working on science and other kinds of things that I've been involved with. And it's kind of like, how is that going to happen? And the answer that we worked out 20 years ago is we're having an annual summer school. It's a great thing. It has an opportunity for me to interact with all kinds of people. You know, people do interesting projects. People come with all kinds of interesting ideas. There are all kinds of, it's a 3-week period when I know I'm going to commit time to doing that. And it's a time when there's sort of an economy of scale to doing a bunch of interesting things there. Actually, that brings me to something else I might mention, which is a problem that I've been trying to solve, which is at our company, we've managed to develop a pretty efficient way of getting innovative projects done. And, it's ideas, there's sort of a cultural awareness that we can solve difficult problems. There's one just, was it today? Where people were like, where it's like, well, that's a difficult problem. It's like, but that's what we do, is we solve difficult problems. That's not a culturally challenging thing for us to, the fact that, oh, that's a difficult problem doesn't mean that we run away, so to speak. But, we've developed that for technology kinds of things. But one of the features of that is that, in a sense, fundamentally, the cycle is fairly well understood, which is we invent things, we make them into products, we sell the products to people, we generate revenue, we use that to invent more things, and it's kind of a nice closed cycle. The thing that I did in the last few years is to take all of the kind of apparatus that we have for getting innovative projects done, project management, kind of cultural approach to doing things, and so on, and port it to basic science and try and use those methods to do basic science. And by golly, it works great. I mean, in a sense, our physics project, we just achieved a vast amount of stuff in a very small amount of time. We just did the same kind of thing with metamathematics project that I just wrote up maybe a month or so ago. And I must say that I'm pretty pleased with ourselves, so to speak, that we managed to get so much done with considerable depth in a comparatively short amount of time by essentially using the methods and intensity that we've developed for doing technology development. Now the problem is that the science that I've been doing, particularly this multi-computation idea, multi-computational paradigm, has led to just a vast number of applications and interesting directions, from chemistry to linguistics to neuroscience to economics and so on, lots of different directions. And they're pretty interesting. I think they're interesting, at least. And the question is how on earth to pursue them, because one needs a bunch of people involved in those things. Well, I know how to pursue them. It's, for 35 years, we've been developing this methodology for doing difficult projects. We know how to do that. We have a whole system for doing that. The problem is the ecosystem that we'd sort of built that involves, you have an idea, you innovate, you make a product, you sell it to people, you bring in revenue, you use that revenue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That ecosystem does not exist for basic science. Now, you can say, let's twist the basic science to satisfy that sort of ecosystem structure. Let's say, let's say we're doing something about, let's say, chemistry. Let's say, well, actually, let's turn that into something where we can generate a bunch of patents. Or let's turn that into something where we're going to make a chemistry-related product. Frankly, that's a distortion of the thing that is the most interesting thing to do. The most interesting thing to do, even if we filed patents, they'd be expired decades before anybody could actually bring them to real monetizable practice. It's something where really the right thing to do, the thing that is best for the world, is something where one is doing basic science, where one is delivering kind of core ideas, upstream tooling, those kinds of things, not, let's turn it into an application so that we can make it into a product so we can generate revenue from it. So that leads one to sort of an interesting problem, which is, how do you deal with a situation where you have the intensity that you're used to applying to product development, but you're applying it to basic science, where in a sense the end point is for the world. I mean, when we build products, we like to think that they're going to be useful for the world, but in the end, the way that I've set up our business is, people find value in our products. That value turns into revenue we get from those products. I mean, we have things that are free and so on, which we kind of doing because I find it fulfilling to do things that are useful to the world. At times I thought they're great marketing. I'm not sure that that's really true. It is certainly fulfilling to deliver things which people find useful. And that, that has sort of a fundamental value, at least to me, and I think to people at our company, that perhaps transcends the pure value of, and we'll make more money by doing that. That's perhaps an idiosyncratic point of view about business, but as far as I'm concerned, a large part of the point is to deliver things that one finds fulfilling to deliver, rather than to maximize revenue. I personally have never been that interested in that, and that's probably a negative for our business. But it's like, so long as we can make enough revenue to continue doing interesting things, that's good. Now, I think the challenge there is that in the basic science case, we're trying to do something. The optimization that is best for the world is an optimization which has no obvious revenue source. I mean, there's you can make swag. We have some very nice physics project swag. I encourage people to look at. We have a donation program, which is good. But in a sense, we need to invent an ecosystem. And I think I've just tried to develop kind of the beginnings of that. We're just starting our Wolfram Institute, whose goal is really to be able to concentrate this sort of basic science mission, just as we concentrate our product development mission, and to do it in a way where at least we can understand that if some person or organization wants to put money into this thing, there's a place to put it, so to speak, where they're helping to generate value for the world at large. I will say that I have been investigating various kinds of tokenization possibilities for basic science. That's a fascinating challenge. I might talk about that at some point. I should wrap up soon because I have to do something very different in a few minutes. Talking of context switching, HYN asked, did I ever own any old Toshiba computers? Yes, I'm sure I did. I think my first decent laptop, small laptop computer was a DG1 made by Data General Corporation. I think it was made by a Japanese subsidiary, or perhaps a company they bought in Japan. It was a very nice object. That must have been in the mid 1980s. I had that. And then the first computer on which I could run Wolfram language, run Mathematica portably, was a compact computer. And that must have been I remember holding it up at a conference and saying, finally we have, and I think that was around 92 or 93 that we could do that. It was after the early versions of Windows didn't allow us to run, they only had 640K of memory, and that wasn't big enough to run our technology stack. Back in those days, something that I haven't had to do for years is whenever I would travel somewhere, I would ship a computer. If I was going to be there for a while, I would ship a computer, big box of to that place and hook it all up. But I'm realizing I haven't had to do that for years and years. HYN is commenting about citizen scientists doing research and get compensated for that research. Yeah, it's a fascinating and challenging thing, because basic research is something where the motivation is different from applied research. I mean, I've done plenty of both of them, and I can say that sort of from the inside, so to speak, there are different kinds of motivation. One motivation is the academic motivation, which is, be part of the academic ecosystem, which means write papers, publish papers in academic journals, get impact factors, get tenure, get paid a pretty good salary for, doing something which is basically teaching plus research and so on. That is one path. I think that unfortunately that path has been one that is increasingly constraining. If you want to do something that is really sort of original, it's pretty difficult to do in that environment. It's like you won't get a grant. It's like I was just talking to a person I know who actually got a Nobel Prize even. And he said he gave up trying to get grants 30 years ago because they never would give it to him because they always said the stuff he was doing was nuts. Happened, one of the things he happened to do eventually, the Nobel Prize Committee gave him a Nobel Prize for it, which is nice, but that didn't mean that the funding agencies and the whole ecosystem of funding, basically said, no, what you're doing is nuts type thing. And I think that's a sort of inevitable feature of the kind of structure of typical government-based and so on funding. So, that's an ecosystem. The academic world is an ecosystem. The question of doing research where you say, I'm going to eventually make a product. Well, there are kind of pieces of ecosystem that exist for that, but where the real motivation is, I'm going to figure something interesting out that's relevant to the world, but might not be relevant as a product for 300 years. That's a very different kind of thing. And I will say that I think the main hook, and I'm still trying to really work this out, is the thing that tends to be true about sophisticated intellectual towers is that they are mostly passed down by word of mouth. Not always, but mostly. And that means that if you look at kind of people who worked in some area of advanced mathematics or something, you'll find, so-and-so was a student of so-and-so who was a student of so-and-so. There's a sort of genealogical student chain. It was passed down by word of mouth. Now, something I realized only just a few weeks ago, and I'm really embarrassed, I didn't realize this earlier. I myself have worked in a lot of areas where I didn't do it that way, where I, came from completely outside the area. I learned about it by reading things, talking to people, figuring stuff out for myself. And in some cases, I was able to make fairly substantial contributions. And I had not really realized, I'd sort of noticed that people found that a bit disorienting, but I hadn't really noticed as clearly as I was thinking about it recently, that it just isn't the way things are usually done. Usually things, a community of people builds up and there is word of mouth transmission of ideas. And that's most of where the know-how exists. Not always, but mostly. And so what that tells one is that there's a certain value that's built up, even in basic research, in the things I'm doing in, I don't know, let's say metamathematics or something, very basic research. There'll be people who know about that, who know about it by essentially word of mouth. And that means that there's sort of this guild of people who know this area. And the question is, how does one take the fact that there's a sort of guild of people who informally know this area, and how does one take that to sort of generate value? Because there is value to, if somebody suddenly says, this thing that was investigated by this guild of basic scientists, turns out we just figured out this is really relevant to the device we're trying to build. We really want to find people who understand that so we can ingest those ideas into this corporate effort that we have. Well, there's a great value to the organization in a sense of just saying, okay, here's the API for communicating with this guild, so to speak. Here's the way to communicate with people who know about that. I mean, I'm always struck by, and for example, Hollywood, dealing with movies and things, that there's a very common thing that you say, movies, they messed the science up completely. Well, why was that? Well, it was because the people who were making the movie just are living in a somewhat different world from the world where you can easily find a person who's an expert in kind of science X. They're sort of separate pieces, and there's no really good API between those. And so I think that's the thing where in these sort of areas of basic science, the guild of people who've worked on this can sort of provide an API that can be plugged into, and somehow there's a way of tokenizing this guild and tokenizing contributions that are made. There's a way of having a secondary market for that. There's a way of plugging that together with uses, but I haven't figured it out yet. So I think that's an interesting direction. And it may be that there's a way to do that that will really crack open this problem of the world, finds basic science valuable, but who's going to pay for it, given that it's good for the whole world, so to speak. That's a thing that has not really been cracked, and maybe it is crackable, so to speak. Anyway, let's see. HYN is saying, I can only feel that academia is on its way out and more sophisticated platforms will emerge for collaboration. Yeah, interesting. I mean, look, I think that um, I will comment on that a little bit. I mean, I think, for example, the fact that we've been live streaming, okay, two things we've been doing that I think are pretty valuable. One is everything is computational. When I write something and there's a picture, it has click to copy, Wolfram language code. You can pick that code out, you can build on it, you can start going from where I left off. And that's been something very practical. You know, you look at papers people are writing about our physics project, they all have all these lovely pictures in them. Those pictures came from code that I developed or was developed for things that I was working on. And they were sort of click to copy it, and then other people can directly use that code and make the same kinds of nice pictures. And that's a very useful way to build, to grow out that science. It's a useful form of knowledge transmission that goes beyond just reading the words on the page. That's one kind of thing. The other kind of thing is live streaming and actually giving people exposure to the process of doing science. I don't believe anybody else has ever really tried to do that. Same with software development, actually. I don't know. I'm not an expert on what's on Twitch and things, but I don't believe anybody else has tried doing that. It's something where I've pointed out to various academics I know, and other people have identified it as, oh, is this the thing academics should be doing? And I think maybe they just don't have, you know, maybe the problem or the issue is that at some level, you know, I don't make my living as an academic. So however stupid I may look on a live stream, it's kind of like, whatever, you know, I don't really care. And perhaps that's something that's that's a more difficult thing for somebody who is making their living as an academic to accept. But in any case, I think that's a valuable thing, because I think it allows one to do perhaps some of this word of mouth transmission of knowledge without actually having people be sort of at a university, etc. I do think that, you know, some pieces of the kind of university academic system are a bit, you know, let's send it through peer review, it's magically going to make sure it's correct, is just completely fictional at this point. And that's a complicated political, semi-corrupt kind of mechanism that, you know, people from outside of science think, oh, that's a sort of a golden mechanism. You know, that's not really the case. And I think people also feel sometimes that, you know, there's the following challenge about science done in sort of the academic setting and science done outside. There are areas of science, for example, ruleology, this whole study of simple rules and so on that I've spent lots of effort on, which don't have a huge stack of things you have to know. They have a certain stylistic collection of ideas of sort of a culture. They don't have a giant stack of knowledge that you need to have. So there's something that's pretty approachable by somebody who didn't go through 10 years of schooling studying, you know, mathematics or physics or whatever else. On the other hand, there are areas, for example, areas of physics, where if you don't know the stuff that was discovered in the 20th century in physics, that relies on a bunch of mathematics that was invented in the 19th century, that relies on mathematics that was invented in previous centuries and so on. If you don't know that stuff, you're really operating in a very disadvantaged way, sufficiently disadvantaged, it's really quite unlikely you're going to be able to make sort of forward progress on the frontiers. You might make progress in understanding things for yourself, but it's unlikely you're going to get further in the frontiers. So it's something where there is a tendency that, you know, so you have to, in these well-developed areas, there's a stack you have to learn. And the problem tends to be, by the time you spend, you know, your 15 years learning that stack, your 20 years learning that stack, you're so submerged in the academic system that it's hard to emerge and kind of think different, so to speak, outside of that. I mean, I myself was probably fortunate that I kind of, you know, I got my PhD when I was 20, so I didn't have that many years in which I was sort of fully submerged and, you know, towing the line, so to speak. Not sure how good I was at towing the line in general, but you know, at being deeply submerged in the academic system. And I think that that's what tends to happen, is to know enough to make frontier contributions in these well-developed fields, you have to have gone through many years of kind of academic sort of study. But when you've gone through many years of academic study, it tends to be hard to think more broadly. So that's sort of a paradox. And to me, there are areas where people who want to kind of think different are going to be able to make more progress than other areas. And they're typically the younger areas of science where there's just less known. I mean, that was true of computer science when it was younger. It's probably still somewhat true of computer science. It's absolutely true of rheology and so on. I think that this is, you know, that's one question that I've certainly asked myself is, you know, as we go forward, are there mechanisms for sort of teaching people sort of, for example, one issue is, you know, how do you get to computational X for all different values of X? It's, you know, I think an important thing, you know, I've obviously spent a lot of time building a technology stack that lets you reach kind of the computation point for lots of fields without going through so much sort of detailed academic-like study of things like computer science. But you know, I think that this question of sort of, you know, is there a mechanism for sort of a different track than universities that gets people to the point of doing research? I will say, and I need to go in a moment, but I'll say a couple of things about that. One thing is that doing successful research is, if anything, more about strategy than it is about mechanics. You have to have the mechanics down. If you don't have the mechanics down, if you can't write the code, if you don't know how to do the calculations, if you don't know the facts, you're lost. But once you have the mechanics down, the question of who's going to be able to really make serious progress versus who's not, it's much more about strategy than it is about the mechanics. There are many people who have the mechanics down. Again, if you don't have the mechanics down, you're handicapping yourself, probably making yourself sort of out of the game. But once you have the mechanics down, the big thing is strategy for doing research. What should you study? How should you approach it? Those kinds of things. And sadly, the education system, as it's usually set up in academia, teaches very little of that. That's just not, you know, it's like, do these exercises. They've been done by many people before. There's a structure. You just do these exercises till you get to the end. Or even, you know, thesis advisor says, here's this problem, go work on it. You know, and this is the framework for working on it. You know, I think in, for example, our summer schools and summer camps and so on, we've had a big emphasis, you know, the point of them is everybody gets to do an original project. I will say that those projects end up, you know, I think I've become pretty good at picking those projects. And when people come in and say, I really want to do this particular project, and I say, I don't think that's going to work very well. And they, you know, and I suggest some other one, and they say, no, I really want to do my project. It usually doesn't work. There is a certain experience that you get in scoping projects and understanding what's doable in a certain period of time. That's really worth learning. If you can learn that for yourself, you're really in good shape. You know, what we try to do at the summer school is sort of give people an on-ramp to doing those kinds of things. I have to go, but fascinating questions. I can see there's a lot of interesting questions saved up for another time, and look forward to being with you on another of these live streams.